Hello, and welcome to Melting Spots, a new podcast from the California Migration Museum. I'm Gabby Santos, your host. I'm the Director of Research and Production at the museum.
And I'm Katie Long, the Executive Director of the California Migration Museum, and Gabby's co-host for the podcast series. We're based in San Francisco, though, as you can probably tell, I didn't start here. I'm originally from the UK. Anyway, my first job is to tell you in 30 seconds about what the California Migration Museum actually is. Because we're new, we're small, and a lot of people haven't heard of us.
Yet.
Yeah, you haven't heard of us yet. But we've got big ambitions. So, in 5 words, we tell stories about migration. We tell exciting, experiential, engaging stories about migration history. And we tell these stories because in 2024, history is too often used as a political weapon. It's too often erased or forgotten or oversimplified. So we tell immigration histories digitally, online, using audio and 360 video and AR, because we believe that's how we figure out who we are and who we want to be. That history is the foundation for a better future. And that's where Melting Spots comes in. Gabby, over to you.
Okay, so in the spring of 2024, I had pretty much the best job ever. I got to interview chefs and restaurant owners all over San Francisco tasting their food.
It was all in the name of research, right? Because the point of eating our way across the city was to try and help us answer a question that goes to the heart of how food relates to identity and belonging. How have San Francisco's immigrants shaped the way our city eats, from the first gold rush to the latest AI boom?
The result, Melting Spots, is a series of stories about the ways in which San Francisco food is the product of more than 175 years of new arrivals here. It's about a place that could never exist without immigrants' kitchens. You can find all these stories on an interactive map at our website, www.calmigration.org/meltingspots. But as I was having these conversations, something else happened. I began to realize that, in many ways, the stories of immigrant food were connected across cuisines, cultures, and even centuries. A first-generation Persian and a fourth-generation Chinese American were telling us the same things, even if they were cooking totally different meals. The stories we were hearing were woven from the same threads: memory and ambition, family and tradition, the power of food as a language that we all speak.
And these stories transcend food. They're about people. And for this reason, they're not really just about San Francisco at all. These are very local stories, but they're windows into a much bigger conversation. Conversations that are being had all over the world. Reflections on how the way we eat now is tied to diversity and multiculturalism and trade routes, and all the controversies and the politics that follows.
So in this podcast series, we're going to follow some of those threads, taking different journeys across the Melting Spots map to explore what immigrant food and drink, and the people who make it, can tell us about belonging, connection, and who exactly it is that we want to be, wherever we are.
Okay, so Gabby, where are we going to start?
We're going to begin at the beginning, because this first episode of Melting Spots is all about beginnings. How exactly did San Francisco's first recipes take shape? Who were the immigrants that brought them to California?
Okay, so let's head all the way back then to 1849, the year San Francisco really began as a city. Because in 1848, the year before gold was discovered in California, San Francisco was a super sleepy town with maybe 1,000 people. 12 months later, by the end of 49, the city's population had exploded. It was now home to 25,000 people, 90% of them men, who'd arrived from all over the world, chasing a fortune.
Wow.
I know, right?
Imagine the chaos of that bustling city, the raucous bars and saloons that were popping up along the infamous Barbary Coast. The site of our first story, the old-school Comstock Saloon in North Beach, is practically a relic of that time, with its grand mahogany bar top and vintage ceiling fans. When you sit in the saloon, it's not hard to imagine yourself back in 19th century San Francisco, with the constant stream of new immigrants arriving every day.
And among them were a few hundred Peruvians, who brought with them the key ingredient for what would become a signature San Francisco drink, Pisco Punch.
Okay, so we're making a Pisco Punch here at Comstock Saloon, and we're starting off with an Acholado Pisco. We're going to pour 2 ounces of that. My name is Johnny Raglan, and I am the proprietor here of Comstock Saloon, San Francisco. Comstock is the last standing bar in what's known as the Barbary Coast neighborhood of San Francisco. In 1849, the city sprung up in clapboard buildings overnight because of the gold rush. This part of San Francisco is where all of the first ships landed in harbor from all over the world. You had people coming from China. You had people coming up from South America because the Panama Canal was not developed yet. So everything that came from the Atlantic had to come around the Cape in the south of South America. So, Pisco finds its way here because of that. Pisco is a brandy. It's distilled from grapes. It was thought of in the very early days as something exotic and of high quality. The price per liter was one of the most expensive things that you could buy. So Pisco was a treat, and I think that people here in San Francisco saw that as something special and unique to San Francisco. I mean, Pisco existed in Peru and Chile and in South America for quite some time, but I think it was here that it was able to showcase. I think that the idea or the name Pisco Punch applied to a number of recipes, but the drink as we know it today was one that was developed at the Bank Exchange Bar here in San Francisco, latter part of the 1870s. All right. There's this thing about cocaine, about how cocaine was the secret ingredient in the Pisco Punch. And I think it's totally plausible. Not so nowadays. The final ingredient is proprietary. It's an aromatic tincture, and I'm the only person here who knows what's in it, and I plan to take that to my grave as well. Our bar dates to 1907, and there was a bar on this site back to 1853. So we're at the vanguard of San Francisco's history in general, but especially in relation to the cocktail. And there's really not a more important drink to this city than Pisco Punch.
Gabby, it's funny because this was actually the very first interview we did for the Melting Spots project. And it turns out I think this is one of the best places to start trying to dig into SF Foods culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things it does really underline is how important it is to think of San Francisco as a port city. A place where new people and new ingredients arrived in the U.S. We're surrounded by water on 3 sides in the city, and that's really important to the immigrant food story here.
Yeah, it's all about the ships, isn't it? Trade networks and immigration routes all depend on those shipping routes. So Pisco Punch reflects that heritage, not just in the alcohol, but the other ingredients too. The same ships that brought Pisco also brought the pineapples that are used in Pisco Punch. And that was a luxury item back then. There was something extravagant about putting it in a drink. I mean, in today's money, a Pisco Punch would have cost about $25.
Oh my God. San Francisco's been overpriced since 1849.
Yeah. But early San Franciscans had new wealth from the gold rush. So buying a Pisco Punch was an indulgence. It was a visible way to show off. You can relate to that today, right? It's tech money buying all those extravagant cocktails now.
But there's also a coda to this story that hints at the way California and the U.S. has always been a place that's better at welcoming new ingredients than new immigrants. Because while Pisco lasted here, Peruvians didn't. 6 months after they arrived, the Peruvians were effectively forced out of San Francisco by anti-immigrant gangs. The Peruvian government actually sent a warship to evacuate them.
Yeah, back then, this city was extremely xenophobic. And we'll see that in our next story too, which is about the thousands of Chinese immigrants who also arrived during the gold rush and who, pretty much as soon as they stepped onto US soil, became the targets of anti-immigrant fervor.
So, after 1849, San Francisco became the center of Chinese immigration to the U.S. and also anti-immigrant pushback. By the 1870s, huge crowds would gather outside of San Francisco's City Hall screaming, "The Chinese must go!" And this pressure was part of the reason why, in 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the first federal U.S. immigration laws, it barred Chinese laborers from entering the country. Chinatown had already been confined to just a few square blocks downtown, but now its longevity was precarious, especially, it seemed, when the 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed downtown completely. But against all odds, the Chinese community survived and rebuilt Chinatown.
In fact, because all the public birth records were destroyed in the fires, the earthquake actually opened up a loophole for new immigrants to arrive using false papers. The community was still shuttered into 24 square blocks on the north side of town. So one of the few ways that this community could connect to the rest of the city, well, it was by opening restaurants that sold Chinese food tailored to white people's tastes.
Hi, I'm Julie Ho, and Samuel has been in my family for 3 generations. Samuel opened right after the 1906 earthquake when the city was rebuilding Chinatown. So Samuel is a century-old restaurant that has really very homey type of Chinese food, kind of like your soul food of Cantonese cuisine. My family started with my great-grandfather, so it was really hard for the Chinese to immigrate over at one point. And so he came through using a fake name after the 1906 earthquake had burned down most of the documents in the city. And that was a whole period where a lot of Chinese were coming through that way. During those early days, Chinese people opened restaurants because there was nothing else they can do outside of their community that was not Chinese. I totally believe that the Chinese food that not we, Samuel, served, but just the Chinese community served, did bridge the cultures together. Dishes like the sweet and sour pork, chop suey, where Chinese people in China have no idea what those are. They probably do now, but before, they had no idea what sweet and sour chicken was, Mongolian beef. But that did definitely bring in the non-Chinese speaking people and just kind of made it more comfortable for them to eat at a Chinese restaurant. But I have to say, for Samuel, we did serve both the quote-unquote authentic Chinese food and the actual authentic Chinese food, because there was a spectrum of customers that came through. Our hours are 11 a.m. to 3 a.m. So in the morning, you have your grandmas eating their breakfasts with their porridge and their Chinese donut. In the afternoon, you have people from the financial district coming in for lunch. In the evenings, you have families. Past 9, you have people from the bars coming in. We all worked at the restaurant as a way to connect with America. Like my aunties and uncles, they learned a lot of the culture through the customers. So it was like a give and take kind of situation, which is kind of neat.
So among folks like Julie, who are deep in San Francisco's Chinese restaurant scene, that story about chop suey is repeated like a big inside joke. There are some variations to the tale. In one version, a group of drunk gold miners staggered into a Chinese restaurant late one night, and the cook, who was tired and ready to close up, just threw together leftover scraps from the plates of previous customers, and the miners loved it. In another version, a Chinese diplomat hosting American guests asked his chef to create a dish that would appeal to both Chinese and American palates.
I love these origin stories.
And whichever version you believe, the punchline's the same, which is that chop suey proliferated across the U.S. well into the 20th century, and it became synonymous with Chinese food.
While in reality, it's an American dish.
Exactly. I actually think this idea of authentic food that Julie made sure to put in big air quotes has haunted San Francisco's immigrant food scene even to this day. The most authentic spots are highly sought after by critics and foodies. But I think for those early Chinese immigrants in the gold rush, Along with many of new arrivals in San Francisco, survival is a lot more important than accurate self-representation.
Yeah, so not only does this idea that more authentic equals better hurt immigrant food, but it's also kind of a myth. However, we will get back to the idea of authenticity in a later episode because, Gabby, I know you have strong feelings about it.
I can't wait. But right here, I think the important thing to recognize is that beginnings aren't always so-called authentic. Even traditional recipes can't avoid substitutions based on what's available or not available here in a new homeland. Collard greens get swapped for kale, buffalo for beef. Even something as basic as bread took on new characteristics and flavors solely by virtue of being made in a different geographic location, susceptible to things as small as changes in temperature and the moisture in the air. In this next story, Lou Jurado will tell us about how one particular kind of bread became uniquely synonymous with San Francisco.
Fresh cracked crab with Boudin's round, dark-baked sourdough and a well-chilled bottle of California Chardonnay is still the quintessential SF meal. Herb Cain wrote that. My name is Lou Jurado, and I used to be the owner of Boudin Bakery. Boudin Bakery is the original San Francisco sourdough, and it's the oldest continuous business in San Francisco. San Francisco sourdough was established in San Francisco in 1849. People were coming to San Francisco as a starting point before they went up into the foothills to mine for gold. The gold miners used to carry a crock of sourdough starter wherever they were in the field. Isidore Boudin came from Paris, France, and settled in San Francisco and opened a bakery in a tent on what is now Grand Avenue. He used a starter that was provided to him by a gold miner. The Boudin starter has been in continuous use since 1849, all the way through the earthquake and all the way through to today. The folklore is that the Lactobacillus San Francisco thrived in the fog. There's something about environment here that lends itself to the sourdough starter feeding itself. I think in my lifetime there's probably been 500 sourdough bakeries in San Francisco. People do, when they come to San Francisco, there's a number of things that they want to see, one of which is Fisherman's Wharf, one of which is eat or see or touch sourdough, and Boudin is that symbol. There are those bakers that will say, aha, the San Francisco sourdough is not a good bread. You must not try my bread. Why? Because it's so commercial. What does that mean, because it's so commercial? Because so many people like it, so many people eat it. And they come to San Francisco, they eat sourdough, they eat Dungeness crab, they drink a good Napa Chardonnay. It's all Mr. Cain said and created, and we along with him.
That meal that the journalist Herb Cain wrote about, of cracked crab with Boudin sourdough, is a timeless image of one of San Francisco's most iconic foods.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I've taken San Francisco sourdough starter, packaged up in my suitcase for relatives back home. That bread is famous right around the world.
But even if Boudin sourdough is timeless, that doesn't mean that it hasn't been constantly iterated on for the last 175 years. I mean, Lou told me that he's seen 500 sourdough bakeries come and go in San Francisco just in his lifetime. After Boudin came Parisian, and today we have modern superstar bakeries like Acme and Tartine who are evolving that legacy.
Yeah, I think that gets at another key idea of San Francisco food's beginnings. These are foundational foods that go all the way back to the start of the city, but they aren't just stuck in the 1850s. I mean, what's more San Francisco than constant innovation?
Yes, exactly. And you know what? It's a similar story for chocolate. Another food that certainly wasn't invented here, but which San Francisco has given its own spin. So, Greg D'Alessandro, who's the chief sourcing officer for San Francisco's Dandelion chocolate, is actually based in Hawaii, so I met with him over Zoom. That did not stop him from talking a mile a minute, and I could see even through the screen his eyes lighting up as he told me why San Francisco and the chocolate industry are a match made in heaven.
That's one of my favorites, actually, yeah.
Hi, I'm Greg D'Alessandro. I'm the Chief Sourcing Officer for Dandelion Chocolate. As the Chief Sourcing Officer, I make relationships with cocoa producers from all over the world to bring cocoa into San Francisco that we transform into chocolate. So much like a number of things in San Francisco, chocolate started in San Francisco right around the gold rush. Groups of Europeans, Ghirardelli and Guittard, two families specifically, came out to make chocolate to sell to gold rushers. And so San Francisco kind of had this combination of a customer base, but also a port. So you get these ingredients that were very difficult to get in other parts of the United States. So the combination of those two things was really important for chocolate to get started. But then as chocolate continued to evolve and develop, then people wanted flavor and bonbons and all of these other things in their chocolate. So instead of chocolate being on its own, it became an ingredient. And as it became an ingredient, what people were starting to look for is a blank canvas that you could then layer flavors on top of. So if you go to Europe, most of the chocolate companies there don't talk about where the cocoa comes from. They talk about their very skilled chefs who are doing, and chocolatiers who are doing interesting things with it, which is great. But one of the things we're trying to do at Dandelion is bring back that complexity of the cocoa itself. We like people to taste the cocoa beans because a cocoa bean from Indonesia tastes very different than a cocoa bean from Venezuela. Cocoa itself developed in the Amazon basin. So part of what San Francisco also has is it has people who culturally are used to eating cocoa. This connects back to why we have hot chocolates and drinks that are from Latin America, because those cultures weren't using the chocolate people are used to today, that is kind of like a heavier roast, more sugar, more milk. They were used to having cocoa like in a beverage. So in Latin America, you're taking cocoa beans, you roast it over a fire, you crush it up, and you can put it in water, and it tastes great. So one of the reasons we have a variety of products in our stores that are harken back to things like a Mexican hot chocolate, these kinds of things, is because the flavor of those beans come through more. And so those more simple recipes for those drinks make more sense when you're tasting the bean again.
Oh, try them side by side to see. They're very, very different. Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, so what does chocolate tell us about San Francisco food? I think it reminds us that San Francisco's beginnings were, in many different ways, a perfect storm. The gold rush not only brought people from all over the world hoping to strike it rich, but other immigrants came with their businesses and ideas to sell products to miners with newfound wealth. It was a mad moment of mixing at a speed which at that point was unheard of in history. Mixing cultures, of recipes, of entrepreneurs. It was maybe the first global migration rush at a port city with access to new ingredients. From that unique moment, you get pisco punch, sourdough, Chinese takeout, and chocolate.
So basically my perfect night in.
Yeah, exactly. It's the beginnings of San Francisco's food culture. And being in the beginning, it's also a reminder that San Francisco foods we don't even think of as immigrant today, right? Bread and chocolate, still have origin stories that involve newcomers arriving in the city looking for something better than what they left behind.
And looking very often for a better life for their families, which very neatly brings us to the next episode of Melting Spots, in which we'll look at how so many of the immigrant restaurants in the city are family affairs.
I can't wait to get into it. But for now, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to listen to all of our Melting Spots episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like them, tell your friends. Better yet, tell the world by leaving us a review.
And don't forget to check out the Melting Spots map itself at www.calmigration.org/melting spots, where you can see all these stories in their SF locations. When you get to our website, you can also find the other tours and migration projects we're working on, and sign up for our newsletter too. I'm Katie Long with Gabby Santos. This podcast was produced by Kathy Edwards and recorded by Grace Coleman. We'll see you soon for the next episode of Melting Spots.